Hello, and welcome to my beginner's guide to the Roland SP-404 Mark II. This guide is intended for beginners or people who are somewhat new to the SP-404, but maybe still a little bit confused about the overall workflow. This guide will be broken down into 3 different sections, and this is the first section, which will consist of the overall setup and layout of the device, as well as sampling and chopping up samples. Part 2 will be about effects and buses and routing, as well as resampling. And then part 3 will be about sequencing and patterns and chaining patterns together to create an entire track. So let's start with setup of the 404, and the first thing to talk about is power. There's a few different ways to power the 404. The first way is to use the AC adapter that comes with it, which you just plug right into the back and you plug that right into the wall. Very simple. The next way you can power it is using AA batteries. It takes 6 AA batteries, which go directly into the back, and you get about 3 hours of runtime out of those 6 AA batteries, which isn't a ton. And if you use rechargeable AAs, you get a little bit less too. I find I get about 2.5 hours out of AA batteries, which is not a ton for me personally, so I prefer these other methods. The third way to power the device is through the USB-C port in the back. A couple of things to note about that is you have to use a USB-C to USB-C cable. So the other side of the cable being plugged in here can't be the old school USB-A or anything like that. The other thing to note about powering it that way is the other device you're plugging into has to provide enough power to power it, meaning that it has to be something like either a laptop or a computer and not a smartphone. You cannot power this through the USB-C with just a smartphone. It has to be something more powerful. This is typically my preferred method. I often plug my laptop directly into the back of the 404, and that's because that USB-C port also provides audio over USB-C, which means you can sample from a computer into the 404 and then record from the 404 back into a computer through that USB-C port, but I'll talk about that more later. So once you have the 404 powered up, you'll need either some headphones or speakers to be able to hear the sound coming out of it. This does not have any internal speakers or anything like that. You can plug in headphones into either the 1/4 inch or the 1/8 inch slot in the front, or you can use the 2 1/4 inch line outs on the back to plug into speakers or a audio interface. There's also multiple inputs for audio devices as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit when I get to sampling. The overall layout of the SP-404 is based on these 16 sample pads, which are all touch sensitive and can hold up to 16 minutes per sample. You get 10 different banks and you can flip through the different banks by using these buttons, and you push the same button multiple times to get from A to F, from B to G, and that's how you get through the 10 different banks of samples. And you can also see in this little header whether you're on A or F, B or G, etc. The pads are touch sensitive, meaning the harder you hit them, the louder they will sound. But if you want to turn that off, you can hit Shift 1, which will go into fixed velocity. And that means no matter how hard you hit the pad, it's going to be full volume. Aside from these pads being used for samples, they're also used for patterns, which I'll talk about in a later video. But just to get over to the pattern mode, we'll hit this pattern select button on top. And you'll see the blinking pads now. These are all patterns instead of samples. And I'm here on the default project, the main project, which I'll talk about projects in a second as well. But you can see if I hit one of the pads, it'll start playing one of the patterns. And then I can just hit the pad again to make it stop. I'll get more into patterns in another video, but for now I'm just going to stick to the sampling side of the device. So I'm going to go ahead and hit pattern select to get back over to the samples. Now, aside from these 10 different banks of the 16 different samples, as well as the 10 different banks of the 16 different patterns, we also have other projects. So these samples and patterns only live on this project. In order to create a new project and get into a different project, we just hit Shift and Subpad down here. You can see under it says Project. And then we can select a different project to load up. I have all my projects filled up right now, but if you're just starting out, you'll see some empty projects. We can also change the sensitivity of the individual pads and the response by hitting Shift 15 to get into the pad setting menu. And then from here, we have some different options for the response on this curve here. We can push Enter with the knob and move between them to see what the different responses are. Basically, the way this chart works is the X-axis is how hard you're hitting the pad, and then this Y-axis is the response of the volume of the pad. I usually leave it in this logarithmic mode because I like to have a decent level of volume no matter how hard I'm hitting the pad. But I believe by default it's maybe set to linear. I can't remember, but it's worth experimenting and trying these different modes to see what you like the best. And then to get out of a menu like this, you just use this exit button right here. So I went ahead and went over to project 2, and now I'm on the C bank, which I can see is empty here. So I can show you how to load in samples as well as record samples through the various inputs. The first thing I want to do is show you how to load in a sample through the SD card, which goes into the side of the 404. To get samples onto the SD card, the first thing you have to do is format it on the 404, even if it's a brand new SD card. So you can do that by using Shift Import Export down here, this 14. And then from there, you'll select Format SD card, and you'll just push in with this knob right here. I'm not going to do that right now because I already have samples on it, but you'll see once you do that and then you bring the SD card over to your computer, you'll see different folders, including an import folder, and that's where you'll put all your samples in. You can even create more folders within this import folder to organize your samples, and that makes it a little bit easier to load them up on the 404. And then from there, once you put the SD card back in the 404, you go back to that Import Export menu, Shift 14. And then you can choose Import from SD card by pushing on the knob here. And if you've got a lot of samples on your SD card, this can be a little bit slow, so just be a little bit patient with it, and it will eventually pull up this menu. So from here, you can actually store entire projects on the SD card, but we just want to import a sample. So we'll go ahead and click again. And now it's just going to list all of the samples that I have on the SD card in that import folder. You can scroll through the samples using the encoder, and it'll play a little preview of what each sample sounds like as you scroll through them. I'm going to go ahead and load up that first sample onto a pad by highlighting it and then selecting this first pad. And then from there, I just want to hit Enter, which is the knob again. So now I can see that that pad is no longer highlighted, meaning I can't import a new sample on it because there's a sample on it already. From here, I can continue scrolling and loading in new samples, or I can get out of this menu by hitting Exit. And now I can see that I've got the sample loaded up here. The pad is lit up, and I can just hit the pad to play the sample. The other way to get samples onto the 404 is by recording them directly onto the device. We can do that by using the line inputs, the 1/4 inches up here. There's also a 1/4 inch input down here that's for a guitar or a mic. You'll need a converter to convert XLR to 1/4 inch if you have a regular microphone like a SM57 or something like that. And the other way to record onto the 404 is using the USB-C slot on the top. So once you have that plugged into a computer or a phone or something like that, if you're plugged into a computer, you'll just have to set the output of the sound of the computer to SP-404, which will show up automatically. And if you're plugged into a phone or a tablet, your sound will automatically be routed to the 404. There's one important button that will allow your inputs to make sound on the 404, and that is this external source button. You can see right now it's not lit up, which means none of the inputs are going to make any sound on the 404. In order to enable it, you just hit that button and you can see it's lit up. So now the inputs will be able to make sound on the 404. This is a pretty common button to get turned off for different reasons throughout using the 404. So if you're ever troubleshooting, try checking this first and make sure that's turned on. So I've got my keyboard here plugged directly into the line inputs in the back. And in order to record to a pad, we're going to use this record button here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit record, select a pad, and then just start playing. And you can see the screen change from wait to record, meaning it's actively recording right now. In order to stop recording, I'll just hit record again. A couple things to note: if I'm recording to a pad and say I play a wrong note, and I want to go ahead and cancel this recording, I can just hit exit. That will cancel it, and now it's not recording, and it's just back onto the record mode. You can also change what happens after you hit record. So for example, when I hit record and then I select which pad I want to record to, this is the wait mode, meaning it's not going to record anything until it hears a sound coming from one of my inputs. I could change this instead to be a count off or just record right away. Let me go ahead and exit out of this by using the count in feature. So if I hit Shift 10, now the count in is off and it will just record right away as soon as I hit record. If I hit Shift 10 again, it will go to 1 measure. So now it's going to count off 1 measure before it starts recording. If I hit it again, it'll go to 2 measures, then 1 more time, and it'll go back to wait. I typically use this wait mode a lot. It's usually the best one for most of what I'm trying to do when I'm recording samples into the 404. As far as moving samples around to different pads, we have copy and delete functions. So if I hit copy, I can select which pad I want to copy and then the destination where I want to copy it to. And then I can just hit copy again. And now I've copied this pad over to here. And now if I want, I can delete this old pad by hitting delete, hit the pad I want to delete, and then hit delete again. It's really important to note that you should be very careful with this delete function in general because there's no undo essentially. You can't really recover a deleted pad or a pattern or a sample or anything like that. So be very careful with delete. Always make sure you're deleting the right pad and make sure you definitely won't need it and you're okay with deleting it. There's also an exchange function in Shift 5 here. So I could do essentially what I just did in one as opposed to copying and then deleting. So if I hit that Shift 5 to exchange, it works very similar to copy where I can hit that pad. Then I can select either one of my existing samples to exchange with, or I can even exchange it with an empty pad and just put it right back where it was. Then I'll hit copy again. And now I've put that one back over there. So now let's jump into editing and chopping up samples. The first thing to note is there's a gate feature for each pad. And that just means whether the pad will continue playing after you've lifted your finger off the pad or not. So for example, when gate is on, the sample stops playing as soon as I lift up my finger. Now that I have this pad selected, if I turn gate off and I hit the pad, it'll play all the way through. In order to stop a pad while it's playing, you can hit Shift Exit, and that will kill all the pads and patterns that are actively playing. And you can see which pad is selected up here in the header. Right now is C1. If I want to select a different pad, I can simply just play it. And now you can see I have C4 selected up there. Or if I want to select a pad without actually playing it, you can just hold down the encoder knob here and then pick the pad. So now I've selected C1 without actually playing that drum loop. So let's go ahead and edit the pitch and speed of a sample. So I'm going to go ahead and use this keyboard sample that I just recorded. And I'm going to go into the pitch/speed menu using this button up here. Now from here, there's a bunch of different features that we can use. These knobs will control these three different functions here. So it's important to note that we can adjust the volume here. We can also adjust the pitch and speed. Now there's some different algorithms that can be used to adjust the pitch and speed, and they change the sample differently depending on which algorithm you have selected. The default one is vinyl, and vinyl means that when you change the pitch, it's also going to change the speed, and vice versa. When you change the speed, it's also going to change the pitch. So you can see when I start changing the pitch, that speed percentage is changing as well. So let's hear what that sounds like. And if I go way down, you can hear it slowed down a lot as well. If I want to get out of this vinyl mode so I can change the pitch or speed without affecting the other one, what you do is you hold Shift, and then you can see down here you have vinyl, yes, and if you scroll over, now it says vinyl, no. There's a few different options for this vary down here, which you'll see you have off, backing, and ensemble. And these are essentially the different pitch and speed algorithms. So backing is typically used for percussion or when you have short sounds. And then ensemble is good for when you have longer sounds like voice or strings or long keyboard sounds, stuff like that. But generally, these are just good to experiment with and see what sounds good. I typically use this ensemble for a lot of things, but I do typically use backing for drums if I need it. I'll go ahead and hit Exit to get out of this menu. And then I want to go ahead and go over to the Start End menu. This is the sample that I've recorded, that I can see the waveform and I can see the playhead moving through it as the sample plays. From here, I can adjust the start and end points of the sample. So if I want to cut off those first couple of notes, and I could maybe move the end point and just make it a short little stab. From here, I could actually truncate out the beginning and end if I wanted to by getting into this menu from clicking here. And then you'll see some different options for truncate, normalize, and emphasis. Truncate will get rid of the non-selected sections. Normalize will just bring the overall waveform to the top, so it'll make it as loud as possible. And then emphasize is a feature that it sort of brightens it up and makes it a little bit punchier sounding. So I'll go ahead and get cancel to get out of that. But I can also just leave it like this and hit Exit, and it will remember where I set those start and end points. Now, a lot of times when you change the start and end points of a sample and you're just starting right in the middle of a waveform or ending right in the middle, you can get a little bit of a click type sound right at the beginning or end of a sample, which you can hear is happening with this keyboard sample now. In order to get rid of that, I'm going to use the envelope. So if I hit Shift Envelope, now I can add a little bit of an envelope to the beginning and end of a sample, so it's a little bit smoother at the beginning and end. So if If I use this knob to add a little bit of an attack, and then this knob to add a little bit of a release, you can hear it got rid of that click at the beginning and end. You can also use these more creatively to get a sound that kind of swells in, or a sound that fades out. And this envelope is really useful for after you chop up samples and when some of them sound kind of rough, this envelope can really smooth them out nicely. Speaking of chopping up samples, let's go ahead and check out the chop menu here. So I went ahead and pulled up a sample here that I thought would be really good for chopping up. And just for fun, before I chop it up, I'm going to go ahead and change the pitch and speed of it, because that's a pretty common thing to do before chopping, is changing the pitch and speed. So let's hear what it sounds like. That sounds pretty cool. So let's go ahead and chop it. Let's get out of this menu, and then we'll hit Shift Chop. This brings us into the chopping menu. There's a few different ways that we can chop. There's what's called lazy chopping, and then there's auto chopping. So lazy chopping is when the sample plays and you just hit pads where you want the marks to go in the sample. And that's the mode that's up by default when you go into the chop here. You can see that first pad is lit up. As soon as I hit that first pad, it'll start playing back, and I can just keep hitting the pads as it plays to create new marks where I want the chops to go. So I'll show you how that's done. It's like this. Now that I've created these marks in the sample, I can go and check them out and see how they sound. And if they sound a little bit off on the start point, I can actually go ahead and zoom in using the encoder here. And I can move that start point around a little bit using the C2 knob. I'll go ahead and put it right where that vocal started. I often like to have chops where it feels like something's happening as soon as I'm hitting the pad. There's some type of a hit of some sort or something musically that's happening that's interesting right at the beginning of a pad. But of course, you can chop however you want and do fun, interesting things. Now at this point, I'll zoom back out. And I want to note that I have not yet put these chops on pads. I'm still in this chop menu. These chops still only exist in this menu. In order to get them onto sample pads, I need to hit Menu, and then I need to go to Assign to Pads. So I'll scroll down and click on that. Now from here is where I'll select the pads that those chops are going to go on. So I can start clicking the pads as I want, but since I've created 16 pads, I'm going to go ahead and just go to an empty bank so I can put them out on one entire bank. So if I hit that, you can see now that I'm on an empty bank, all the pads are blinking. I can simply just select all the pads. And then from there, I can just hit Enter to chop. And now those individual chops will be assigned to these pads on this H bank. Now there's a couple things that I would do with chops like this as soon as I chop them up. One of which is that I want gate turned off for all of these pads because I want them to play all the way through just when I tap them, as opposed to being choked out as soon as I lift my finger off. I could go through and turn off gate for each individual pad, or since I want to do the whole bank, I can just hold Shift and then hit gate. And now I've got the gate off for the entire bank. The other important thing I want to do is, because these are all from the same sample and I'm going to want them to play back to back, what I want to do is put them all in a mute group so that when I play one and then I play another one while that first one is still playing, it will choke out that first one so I don't have the samples overlapping. In order to do that, I'll go into mute groups here. That's Shift 8. And then you can see I've got 10 different mute groups. In this first one, I've actually already got a couple of pads in that mute group. I want a totally new mute group. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll over. I've got some samples in that mute group as well. And a lot of these. And here we go. Now I'm at an empty mute group. And I'm just going to hit all the pads to add them to this mute group. And then from here, I can just hit Exit. And now when I play these samples, they'll play all the way through because gate is off, and they will choke each other out because they're all in a mute group. So let's hear what that sounds like. So I'm back over onto that original bank, and I want to show you another way to chop up this sample. So here's the original sample again. And I'll go back into that chop menu, Shift Chop. I'm going to go ahead and erase these marks. I want to create new marks. So I'm going to go into the menu and then delete all marks. So now I'm back as if I had never created those initial marks. And instead of doing the lazy chop method where I select the individual pads as the sample plays, I'm going to use one of the auto chopping methods. So I'll go into the menu and I'll go to auto mark. From here, I've got a few different ways I can auto mark. I can do it by time division. I can also do it by, if I use this C2, I can switch to level, which means that when the sample gets to a certain volume level, it'll create a new mark. Or I can use transient, which means when the sound changes from really soft to really loud, that will create a new mark. And I can change the parameter on that to be soft, mid, or hard. So it'll adjust based on the transient there. The other parameters I have are the level. I can go from 0 to 10. So it's just going to create a new mark based on how high the level is based on that parameter. And then the other mode was time division. This is just going to split the chop up into equal sections, and I can go from 2 all the way up to 16. So let's go ahead and do 16 by time division. So this will create 16 even chops in that sample. Now let's hear what these sound like. And from here again, I could zoom in using the encoder and adjust the individual start points. And from there, I would go ahead and just do, again, assign them to pads and select which pads to assign them to. Another common way to chop up a sample like a drum break here would be to take it and take some individual drums out of it so we can play drums on the pads from this one original sample here. So let's go ahead and take this sample and let's copy it over to a few different pads. I'll copy it to 13 and then again to 14 and then one more time to 15. And from here, let's try to grab a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat so we can play the drums on these pads. So if I go ahead and go to this first one. So let's go ahead and grab a kick from this first sample. So I can hear there's a kick right at the beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and move the end point right to the beginning and then zoom in. You can see that kick right at the beginning there. And there we go. I have a kick. Now I can just hit exit. I don't even need to truncate it if I don't want to. But now I've got a kick there. If I did want to truncate it, I can go back in, hit menu, and then truncate. And now this sample is just this kick here. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for the snare here. We'll have to move the start point now to find the beginning of that snare hit. There it is right there. And then we'll move the end to get closer to there. I can zoom in to get a little bit closer to the beginning of the transient. I can zoom in really far and get right at the very beginning of it. And there we go. I can hit truncate again. And now I've got a kick and snare. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the hi-hat. This sample has a lot of different interesting hi-hat-ish sounds in it, which is pretty cool. Let's go ahead and grab this one right here, which is very quiet. This will be a good chance to show how to make a quiet sound a lot louder. So let's go ahead and truncate that. So now you can hear I've got this really quiet hi-hat sound. In order to make it louder, I'm still in the start end menu. I'll go ahead and go to normalize. And you'll see that'll bring the volume of the waveform all the way up to the very top. So that's much louder now. And then maybe I'll take this hi-hat sound and I'll pitch it up a little bit. It's a pretty interesting hi-hat sound. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it on this vinyl mode because that's going to be the smoothest as far as changing the pitch of an individual drum sound like this. Maybe not the most exciting drum sounds here. This hi-hat's a little odd, but you get the idea. You can take one sample and chop it up into individual drum hits and create a drum groove out of it. A couple of other sample related features I want to show real quick. One is the chromatic mode. So if I select this keyboard sample, then I hit Shift-4 to go into chromatic mode, I can now play that keyboard sample almost like a keyboard. I have different pitches here. I can go ahead and scroll up an octave or down an octave with the scroll wheel here. I can also change the scale that's used here. So here's chromatic. I have every note. If I go ahead and push on the encoder knob, it'll change it to major. If I push again, it'll go to minor, Dorian. It's got a number of different modes. I'll go ahead and hit exit to get out of that. Another feature we have for samples is reverse. So if I will go ahead and hit this sample, and then hit reverse, it'll play backwards, which is a really cool sound. So hopefully you got some good stuff out of that. Check out part 2 to learn more about effects and bus routing, and then part 3 to learn more about patterns and sequencing. Thanks for watching.